Welcome, everyone, to today's broadcast. This is our webcast on automating detection and response to phishing attacks, featuring myself, of course, Paul Asadoorian from Offensive Countermeasures and Security Weekly. John Strand is here with me presenting as well. John, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me. Pretty excited about this one because I didn't do any work, but something tells me it's going to be a lot of work to get through it.
We're going to play like Whose Slide Is It Anyway, which I missed while we were at DerbyCon.
So
and I chose the random slides for today to present with John.
So dead.
So there's just going to be shenanigans for the first part of this until Greg Foss is here with us, who has the actual information that you want to hear for this webcast, to be honest with you, because we just have ridiculous stuff. Greg, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Greg, what is your role at LogRhythm?
So I run the global security operations team. So essentially, we're the main LogRhythm users at LogRhythm.
Sweet. It's awesome. Well, it's nice to have you here. Greg and I have known each other for some time, and I'm excited to have you on the webcast today because, like I said, you actually have the really cool technical slides. So basically, my part that I'm going to present with John is I think we've been giving people bad advice about phishing and specifically phishing protection. John's going to weigh in and kind of quantify some of that by saying how successful it is to phish your customers. So actually, John's not going to be that difficult. You just kind of share stories about how and why phishing attacks are still successful for your customers and give some real-world examples without giving away information about your customers, of course. And then Greg's going to give us the actual solutions. So,
because aren't they releasing some cool things today, Greg? Aren't you guys?
Yes.
We will be very, very soon. So,
yes.
And the coolest part, I think, is we want to make it open source.
That's awesome.
Well, and I was going to ask you about that. Did you guys fail capitalism school? Not that there's anything wrong with that, because I failed capitalism school, and Paul pretty much handles a lot of that stuff for me. But you guys released like a lot of like the NetMon Premium. Yep. You got this tool that you're going to release as well. So there's a lot of things that you guys get back. So that's why we like you.
It's awesome.
All right.
Oh, thank you.
All right. So I really think that largely we have been giving customers and enterprises and businesses and users bad advice when it comes to protecting yourself against email phishing. In some of the articles I read in prep for this webcast was, kind of like what everyone's saying. What are some people saying about phishing? What is the press reporting on? What are some vendors in our space that have articles about phishing? What are they saying? They basically talk about the problem, a little bit about the solutions that we've been trying to give people for this. And quite frankly, I think most of them kind of suck. Was my kind of view take on that. John, do you find when you go to customers and you ask them like what do you have in place or what's your plan to protect against phishing? Like, do you find that they pretty much have had bad advice?
I love this slide. Frying up bacon, take your shirt off so you don't get grease on it. That's a solution, right?
Yes, it is a solution.
And there's a bunch of solutions kind of like that. We're going to talk about phishing, but another way of looking at it is right now we're working with a payroll company for BHIS and offensive countermeasures, and we need to get them some files because if we try to email the files in to them, they're like, sorry, we don't accept attachments. It's like, okay, well, here's a Dropbox link. Sorry.
Nope, don't do Dropbox.
Can't go to Dropbox. What about box.com? Sorry, can't do that. So how do we get files to you?
We're going to mail you a thumb drive. Oh, no, we can't put thumb drives in our systems either.
So security has clearly gone in and secured things. But
you're just going to have to mail them a computer, John. They can turn it on and read the files.
So now what's going on is they gave us some janky, weird file server that is not blacklisted. Mm-hmm. And they're like, here's a service out of Estonia, and you can put your files here. Our security team hasn't blacklisted this. So sometimes trying to solve the problem, you create far greater problems in the process. That's
a great example. So I think the first piece of advice that we give is about passwords in general. And also, I want to pick on the fact that while you should choose a good password, and what that means is really up for a lot of debate, but how little that could actually help you when it comes to email phishing, because largely it's bypassing that's why we do the phishing as attackers, and attackers do the phishing, is they don't need to have your password. They may get it after that, but it doesn't matter how long or complex your password is once the attacker's gotten it might, but largely it doesn't. I mean, that's a whole separate series of webcasts about Active Directory security and specifically password security. But I just think we've been giving users bad advice about passwords because it doesn't matter. Now, where it could matter in phishing, if you think about it, is if I do take over one account via a password type attack, I can then maybe use that to launch phishing attacks. And I mean, that can create a very unique problem. And John, I'm not sure what your kind of angle is on passwords as it relates to phishing attacks in those two different, kind of scenarios.
So a couple of different things. I love the toothbrush analogy whenever we're talking about passwords. It's like, number one, you choose a good one, don't share it with anyone, change occasionally. And then, it's like
underwear,
highly complex. No one's ever said have a highly complex toothbrush.
It's true. Or complex underwear. I mean, underwear kind of falls in the same category.
Kind of falls in that category too.
You don't share it.
But sometimes you do want long underwear. We've completely gotten off track.
Way off track.
All right. So a lot of our attacks, like let's talk about phishing and the way that you can actually do this effectively in many organizations. The idea of coming from the outside of an organization, sending an email and then getting shell still happens quite regularly. But as we're kind of seeing right now, with the Deloitte attack, it appears that it's possible that some type of password spraying happened. They got access to an admin account, and whether it's Office 365 or whether it's something like Outlook Web Access with Exchange Web Services, it doesn't really matter. With most of the organizations, we're getting in about 1 or 2 organizations a week with Mail Sniper, and all we need is one mailbox. Once we hit that one mailbox, then we can effectively pull down the global address list. And now we have all of the email addresses to do basically a phishing attack from that point on. And I'll talk more about how we progress and how the tools are going to help with that. But the point is that one bad password gets us into an organization, and then that can be leveraged to the rest of the phishing style attacks.
Yeah, that's really bad, actually. So I wanted to talk about two-factor authentication as well, as we were actually talking about this right before the show. And, as the cartoon says, if it's difficult to read, the site wants two-factor authentication, a retina scan, and a urine sample. And I think there's a lot of issues with two-factor authentication, and specifically how it doesn't help you with some of the problems that result or some of the problems that attackers will prey on in order to have a successful phishing campaign. In a lot of cases, two-factor authentication does not help. For one, people's misunderstanding of multi-factor authentication in general, such as, well, I have a username and I have a password. Isn't that two-factor authentication? I'm not kidding. That happens.
Something I have and something I have.
Something, crap. And something everyone else on the internet could potentially have as well.
It doesn't work.
That's bad. The other concept, John, I think is one that you've covered certainly on previous webcasts, is that when you set up two-factor authentication, especially if you're a larger enterprise, you can't protect every single method of authentication. There's always that weird case, especially when we get to mobile, especially when we get to APIs, that their two-factor authentication doesn't cover. Sometimes, like in the case of an API, it might not even be a human being that's got to authenticate to something. It might be another program running on another computer, and therefore there's no two-factor authentication, and that is the gateway into that particular organization.
And that's absolutely correct. So like you have Outlook Web Access that has two-factor authentication, but you have Exchange Web Services enabled. All right, so you've shut off Exchange Web Services, you've got two-factor on Outlook Web Access, but then you have mobile connection so people can access and authenticate. Or you have a SharePoint server that's also going back to Active Directory. And basically what this is getting down to is you should have absolutely no exposed services whatsoever that connect back into Active Directory for authentication that is not protected by two-factor authentication. And we're now getting to the point with most of our customers where basically telling them point blank, if it's sensitive and it's Active Directory related at all, put it behind a VPN. Don't allow that to be exposed to the internet at all.
And then make sure your VPN has two-factor authentication, which that's a problem, and that's an easier problem to solve. Most enterprises have figured that out, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Where I think two-factor authentication may actually help, and I'm curious to get Greg and John, your thoughts on this, is with social media. And other things that you authenticate to that are most often phished. I'm not sure how high the likelihood is that an external attacker is going to phish an employee's social media in order to gain access to the organization, although that's a very feasible attack path. I see it more on the personal user side, where there's a lot of Facebook users, there's a lot of Twitter users, there's a lot of Google Drive users, and we've seen many phishing attacks, and this isn't necessarily email phishing attacks that prey on getting your password, and they trick you into giving your password and authenticating to one of these social media services or online, SaaS services, and they get your password. In my opinion, two-factor authentication, even if it's SMS at that point, which has its own issues, but is a good stopgap measure in protecting the credentials. Now, in an enterprise, those credentials might be reused to gain access to the corporate infrastructure. So in that case, is it a good measure in the case of phishing in social media?
So I was going to say the kind of on that idea of the SMS, I think that's kind of where you're going with this. I got a question. Is it better to have SMS two-factor authentication than no two-factor authentication at all? It was funny at this con, we were talking about SMS authentication. I had a bunch of people that were up at the table and they're like, oh yeah, I'm not using that. It's using SMS and that's broken. And I think that that's a bad approach. I think that you want any type of two-factor authentication you can get. Some are better than others, but at the exact same time, we shouldn't completely discard something just because it can be broke in some situations.
So the story I have on that is there was a journalist who was compromised, and the way that they did it was they called up his cellular provider. They impersonated him with some information that they used, OSN to gather, and they got his phone number transferred to their SIM card. After that, they were able to intercept and receive all of the two-factor authentication or all of the communications that if you reset a password, they're going to SMS your phone to get a code, and started to take over his life. Fortunately, he was able to call the provider and fix the issue. But when it's tied to just your cellular number like that, that can be a dangerous situation, which is why I don't recommend it as a second factor. I think the Google Authenticator in that scenario is a much better option and really just as easy to use because it's on your phone. But I do think in some of the Facebook phishing that I've seen, they send messages to people, they trick them, they say you need to log in. And I don't know if you've noticed on Facebook too, people will post like these polls or tests that they've taken, and they actually link it to your Facebook by requesting authentication. And some of those are fake. They're phishing attacks that are collecting your Facebook credentials, which, do you see a high likelihood of, do you do that in your test, John? I mean, you can't really attack the social media accounts for the people that work there, right? That's usually off the table.
Yeah, it's off the table, and even their own personal mobile devices, a lot of times they aren't owned by the company, so we can't test those either. And that's just a practicality and legal aspect. I know there's some companies that are like, in our pen test, we hack their social media accounts and their home phone numbers and their wireless routers and their cars and their garage door openers. And it's like, yeah, you're a criminal. But we have to have some bounds. But at the same time, even though there are bounds, those are definitely areas that are ignored by the security community by and large. And a bad guy will absolutely go after those things. So we got this really weird place where we're not testing as many things as we should, just because of the legal and the moral bounds of it. And I don't necessarily know if that's a bad thing. It's just the way it is.
So one of the things that we tell users with respects to email phishing has historically been, and I mean, this goes back to when I was working for the university, and some of the first email phishing and virus campaigns like I Love You, Melissa, Anna Kournikova were coming out. It was a great time if you're an email phisher because many organizations, in fact, most organizations, had no protection against this and hadn't done any kind of end user awareness training or told their end users to look out for any of these style attacks. And one of the immediate things that we came up with was, well, when you get an email, make sure that it's proper English. And for those of you that write and speak English, that can be hard.
all of my emails are going to be completely shot.
Completely, most of mine too. As is the comment, I like cooking my family and my pets. And if you're not using commas, you could be a psychopath or just lazy and not use commas. But the point is I think that the tips such as this that we've given users to identify phishing probably aren't too great. Like looking at the language. I think largely in phishing attacks, we've seen the attackers really step up their game and know this now and are producing phishing emails with proper spelling and grammar, and with some of the indicators inside of that email that we've taught people to look at, such as the recipient, the sender, the email, all of those things. Does it have all those things that we've told our users to look for? The attackers are largely doing. Do you find this to be the case, John, as well?
You know what, you were talking about the past, right? You know, Melissa, I love you, Anna Kournikova. And you remember that back in the day, a lot of the phishing attacks were actually using Word documents with macro. Like we go back to 2005. It's so nice that we don't have that problem today.
Well, and that's just an extension of
somebody's going to be like, this problem's still a problem today. I don't know what John was saying. It must have been crazy.
Well, and that's just an extension of the phish. It's really a twofold thing. You got to convince someone to, open the email, download the attachment, and then enable macros in their environment. And it's amazing that those attacks are still valid, because we've told people, hey, don't open emails that look suspicious. Don't download attachments from emails, and definitely don't enable macros. But you can build a successful social engineering campaign that people are like, oh no, I need to open that email, and I need to download that attachment, and I need to enable macros because this is for a financial filing or a loan, or it's a notice from a lawyer, it's a court document. Like all those are scenarios. People just forget about everything that's been said to them about not opening things, and they do it anyway.
Well, the other thing is Microsoft has made it even worse, right? Like they used to only pop up error messages whenever you open up a Word document that had macros in it. Now, every single document that I open, it opens up and it's like, hey, this was downloaded from the internet. What does it say? Be careful, files from the internet can contain viruses. Unless you need to edit, it's far safer to stay in protected view. And you click enable editing. Every single file I open now asks me that exact same question. And that doesn't actually make people more secure. It's just basically desensitizing the population for these pop-up boxes. So now you got enable editing and enable content. I've got one here with macros. And I just opened 3-4 documents in a row, and they all ask me if I want to enable editing, including the one with the evil macro. So we're actually training people for bad behaviors.
Absolutely. One of the other things, too, was, we do tell people to keep your information private. I mean, and that's part of the very first phase of any successful phishing campaign, or the horrible name, spear phishing campaign, and farming, and just all these awful things that we try and use to describe these attacks. We'll tell people, hey, don't post your information online. But if the attackers know things about you, then you're going to be phished. And it turns out you really don't need to know things about you, maybe just your email address, which is pretty easy to find in a lot of different ways. In fact, it's probably on the internet somewhere. But you don't need to know something about them in order to have a successful phish. You need to know what's happening in the world around them. And that can be much easier to figure out. In fact, we see phishing campaigns all the time based on current events, natural disasters, politics, whatever the case is, you're going to see a phish about that. And that's not because the attacker knows something about you. It's because they watch the news. So I think that's largely bad advice, in my opinion. Also,
and
go ahead, John.
And if I know enough about you, I can build that profile and I can develop a phish that is going to be something that's interesting to you. If you're into tattoos, great. I can make my phish targeted to tattoos. If you're into Pez dispensers, I can target it to that. And that gets into a difference between your general kind of phishing attack and your spear phishing attack, because they are very, very different creatures. But the spear phishing attack is a lot more dangerous than your standard phishing attack.
Yeah, also, as John's saying, people publicly share a lot of information about themselves, and that's just the way of the world today. And like it or not, your employees are probably going to share something about themselves online that could be used in a phishing attack. Okay. Security awareness programs, and John, you kind of harped on this already, that you really only need one user to become the victim of a successful, and have your campaign be successful. It is, and I don't want to say that I'm playing devil's advocate in the security awareness training on this slide of this. So I'm saying you can train. Now, awareness is different from training. Those are two separate things. And what we tell people to do is build a security awareness training so that users are aware of potential threats. And doing that 100% all the time is difficult, so you're going to find that one user. Also, phishing comes in multiple forms, requiring constant awareness that you need to provide to your users. As the threats change, You have to make your users aware of that. There is going to be a time, pretty much all the time, there's going to be gaps in that as phishing threats evolve. You may not know about them now. You have to find out about them. Then you have to bring that awareness to your users, and you can't just do that with an email to everyone because not everyone's going to read it. So there's gaps in your security awareness program. And it's not about prevention, it's about awareness. And you hope that the one user who gets it, that recognizes it, tells someone so that you can block it before it gets to that one user that you know is going to click on it because they haven't paid attention to security awareness, or they're just always going to open it. So I still think even with some of the strides we've made in security awareness programs, you need technology to solve the problem.
Well, I agree with the technology, and we're starting to get a lot more customers, and this is something we've noticed, especially with Security Weekly and SANS customers, where they're getting a lot better. Not necessarily at people not clicking links, but what happens next. Like that isolation, the firewalls being enabled, using strong passwords or two-factor authentication. We're seeing a lot of improvements in that side of it. Mm-hmm. But you're still right. In a lot of scenarios, it just takes one person making a mistake, getting compromised, and then once you have that beachhead, it's pretty much game over. It's just a matter of time.
All right, this one is going to spark a little bit of debate, but I've been thinking about this problem lately. And one of the strategies that we're employing in the enterprises today is, or even in the mid-market as well, there's lots of solutions out there, all the way from small businesses. I got a firewall. It's got some malicious URL protection, so I'm going to enable it. When you go all the way up to the enterprise level, do you put it on your next generation firewall? Do you put it on your proxy? Do you use both? Where do you get your threat intelligence? How do you manage the malicious URL blocking? What if there are people that need to get to certain URLs as a function of their job, but they're being blocked? Now, and that can be a good strategy. However, playing devil's advocate, users are not always going to be behind your gateways as they travel. They use laptops. They're going to venture outside the network. They're not going to benefit from that protection that you put in place on your network. Also, phishing doesn't always come through your gateway or easily identifiable through your gateway. I think the best example there are USB thumb drives in the parking lot. I don't know, John, if that's still a thing that you do today on test, and it is. So it is still a valid thing. That doesn't require that network traffic go through your gateway, so it has that limited purview into what's happening to the user. Also, there's that time shift thing, right? By the time the gateway realizes that a URL is malicious, it might have already gone out to your users, so you're behind the curve because the threat intelligence is very different across all of the different vendors and different sources. So to align what's happening in phishing campaigns with specifically what's going on in your environment, there's often a gap there as to when you get that protection. I also think that when you talk about it on a either a proxy or a next generation firewall, there's just too many different attack vectors for this phishing that to be able to block them all. So the inspection not only has to happen on your web browsing, but it has to happen through Dropbox and Google Drive and file sharing and internal SMB shares and mobile devices and social media. And like you said, all those different ways in which you could possibly share a file or get a link. The list is enormous. And being able to identify and block all of those different attack vectors is a really hard job for your gateway. And what's going to happen is you're going to say, well, my users need to get to Dropbox, so I'm not going to do the inspection. Or maybe I'm doing SSL decryption so that I can look inside some of these services so that I can block things that are happening inside of a Facebook connection or whatever. That's a lot of overhead, and I don't think a really good way to solve this problem. I don't know if you guys agree, disagree.
Agreed. Completely agree.
So, John, what is your recommendation for folks after I've poked a lot of holes in it for malicious URL blocking in an attempt to thwart phishing attacks?
Honestly, we're now at the point where we're talking to our customers. You talk about user awareness training. The first thing is it's training. Michael Phelps, because he won a bunch of gold medals, if he stops working out, starts binge drinking, smoking pot, and gives it another year or so, he's not going to be in that tip-top shape. It's something that you've got to do constantly, and you've got to keep up to date. And that's the biggest thing with user awareness training. However, as far as stopping emails from coming in, by and large, most of the time what we're doing is we're talking about segmentation, user behavioral analytics, making sure firewalls are enabled, using strong passwords, using things like LAPS for the local administrator password. Those are the things making an assumption that a compromise is in fact going to occur and creating that post-exploitation kind of protection that limits the attacker's ability to move laterally east to west in an organization is really where we're spending a lot of our time with our customers, telling what they need to focus on.
Yeah, and that's really the shift that I recommend as well. Is do some things on your proxies and next generation firewalls. However, I think when you start getting into malicious URL blocking and SSL decryption, I think you should take those efforts and put them on the endpoint and put them on the inside of your network. Stop, like you said, John, that lateral movement. And basically, someone's going to get phished. Limit the damage as best you can on that particular workstation. So, yeah, we're in agreement there. Okay. So, John, before we get to Greg, any other thoughts on what's working for you in email phishing campaigns against your customers, and what are some things your customers are doing that are good? We talked about things in the first part of this presentation that we're not huge fans of, and the bad advice that I think people get. So what's working for you, number one? And number two, what's some good advice for your customers that you've been giving?
So what's working for us is a lot of the highly customized spear phishing attacks that we're trying to generate for our customers. And we have a number of scenarios where customers basically stop us cold. They're like, nope, you can't do that. And the reason why you can't do that is because we know it's going to work. So there's a lot of that type of pushback that we're getting from organizations. And in a lot of scenarios, we have customers, not all of them, we have a lot of great customers without question, but a lot of the scenarios we have customers that are intentionally kind of neutering the spear phishing attack to make it something like trying to make it like, oh, well, UPS, shipping notification.
Yep.
Well, yeah, people have pretty much learned never to click on that. And I feel sometimes with some customers, once again, not all, that they're trying to push it into a situation where they know that they're going to quote unquote work, or they're going to be successful in that. So that's a problem, right? We also have some customers. We talked about one of our customers at DerbyCon. We did a presentation with him where he talked about how we improved what they did. And they basically stopped all attachments from coming in. Basically, all attachments get ripped off, they get dropped into a folder, they get analyzed, and if you want that particular thing, you have to basically request it. And it's a draconian way of approaching phishing, but this is an organization that is an extremely sensitive organization. They have a very low risk tolerance. So that's changing things quite a bit. But when it comes to larger organizations, it's pretty much still wide open like it was even 10 years ago.
Interesting. I'm going to turn it over to Greg Foss from LogRhythm to talk about the Phishing Intelligence Engine that is soon to be released. Is that right? And open source? Is that true?
Yeah, soon to be released. So we have our first annual user conference coming up here in a couple weeks, and so we're actually going to be trying to release it at this event.
Sweet.
So yeah, so about 2 weeks out, we're planning to push this out there, and one of the main things with it, why we wanted to make this open source, is we want to get feedback from the community for how we can improve this, what other open source or commercial tools they're tying into the system, and really kind of help build it from what we kind of grew it from internally here. So essentially, one of the questions we got when spending a lot of time developing this framework was, why are we spending so much time kind of on the development and upfront analysis of phishing? And I think the main thing was the long-term time-saving, resource-saving, and ability to simply respond to a lot of the phishing attacks that we're getting. Because right now, I mean, that's something for any of the security analysts out there. Phishing can be a giant drain on their whole team. If you want to respond to it properly, understand if anyone's fallen for it, and perform analytics on it and gather metrics to help improve your program. So we wanted to try and automate as much of this as possible so people could focus more on the more interesting attacks while really kind of handling the commodity stuff much quicker.
Sorry, feel free to say next slide.
All right, thank you.
We'll just go with that.
Yeah, so this is why I was excited you were going to be on here, John. So Mail Sniper was something we were playing with right when it came out, and it was something where it's like, wow, this is fascinating. Like going through scraping inboxes, pulling content out, and stuff like that. And after playing with this for a while, we were like, how do we do something like this for the blue team and automate it and set it up in a way that's both secure but also getting all the information we need kind of into the SIM in a way where we can scrape this data, aggregate it, perform analytics, and then respond to some of these attacks. So actually reaching into inbox and pulling mail out and essentially hard deleting them from systems as we detect these attacks coming in. John, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about Mail Sniper.
So yeah, we've already discussed it a little bit, but this is a tool that was written by Bo or Daft Hack at Black Hills Information Security, and it's specifically designed to, well, we do password spraying to identify passwords because Outlook Web Access unfortunately has very, very poor control of identifying valid passwords versus invalid passwords. Once we've identified a number of valid passwords, then you can use Mail Sniper to access those mailboxes through Exchange Web Services, and then start pulling email off of those systems, querying email from those systems, and then also using it to then find additional targets that you can actually go after as well.
Right. And you require credentials, obviously, to get into the inbox before you can start using Mail Sniper.
Yeah, and that's why that Mail Sniper is the most important part, right? You know, we can do that password spraying with something like Burp, making sure to follow redirects so it gets to the proper size, so we can see an invalid page size and an invalid page size for an invalid and valid user.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so essentially that kind of led us to developing what we're calling PI, Phishing Intelligence Engine. And the reason we went with Office 365 was because that's what we were using internally. And right away when we switched to this, we kind of realized, okay, this is much more difficult getting logs and aggregating data about who's logging in, what attacks we're seeing on it, than it is a standard Exchange server. So that's what kind of led us down this path towards figuring out, how to scrape message trace logs, how to get admin activity logs, and all of this data back on site so we can search through it, aggregate it, and generate alerts and things like that on activity.
Also, and John, I don't know if you're seeing this in your customers as well, Microsoft is very heavily pushing people to Office 365 with Exchange. If you need to renew your Exchange licenses locally, I think
they want you.
Yeah, you're getting sold on the cloud solution for sure.
Right.
Yep.
Next slide. Yeah, so essentially we have our public GitHub page. So this is for our LogRhythm Labs team. And this is essentially where we're planning to put all of this code as we release it. So keep an eye on that GitHub page if you want to play around with this and try it out in your environment.
Now, Greg, is this the project that stemmed from the your internal kind of get together with your various teams within LogRhythm where you get to work on something that's related, right? Can you just explain that briefly?
Yeah, definitely. So we have our internal hackathons. So every quarter, you kind of get together with a team and you develop some new use case, either with the SIM or without, just something that can either help our customers or us internally. And so it's pretty fun. It's this competition. They give you a few days to develop a solution, and from there they decide. There's various awards for most awesome tool, most innovative, most shippable. Those ones actually end up back in the product. So it's a really cool thing that LogRhythm enables for our engineering department to kind of put some of this stuff together. So this was a project that we started working on a while ago, and now we're actually to a point where we've fully implemented this on our internal systems, and we're to a point now where we're ready to actually push this out into the community.
Sweet.
And if you want, just kind of click through here. All right. So essentially, this is what we're trying to do with this system. And as much as possible, we want to automate this and really streamline the response and analysis of phishing attacks. So basically, whenever a user sends a message in to us, we're going to have an automated response back to them that says, thank you for reporting this, and kind of gives them some high-level information on what we're going to do with the email. As soon as we get an email in, we're going to start generating a case within the SIM and automatically start looking through the data that we have to see, what's happening with this email. We're doing regex checks on the subject line, the sender.
So Greg, this is like I'm working for an enterprise and I get an email. I'm like, wow, that looks suspicious. So I'm going to forward it off to this automated system for analysis.
Exactly. And
that's actually cool. That's something that you could even train your users to do. That would be pretty neat too, if it scales like that.
Exactly, and that's something where, and we'll get into it in a little bit, but we made a Outlook button to allow them to do this more easily. So Because one of the main issues we had when we first started developing this was how do we handle the dynamic reception of emails? They could come as a forward, they could be an attachment, those types of things. So the main way we like getting the emails is as an attachment so that we can pull that out, scrape the headers, get all the full detail from the attack, and then find out all the related metadata, search back through the SIM, search back through other attacks we have, compare against threat lists, do regex checks, various things like that from the second one of these is received. We're also doing checks on messages as they come in. So our Pi system, basically, as soon as we see subjects that are odd or something like that, we start analyzing that message in the back end and start saying, okay, let's check these links, let's throw this file in the sandbox and things like that. And we'll actually automatically start doing some of this if it matches our known threat lists. So known odd subjects, odd senders, if there's WordPress pages in the links and stuff like that. All the kind of common things you look for when analyzing email. We're just trying to take kind of most of that commodity stuff and offload that and do it as automatically and quickly as possible.
So, Greg, basically, if I'm a user and I get a suspicious email, I push a button, it sends it off to your system. If you find that that is an email phishing attempt with some kind of malicious Word document attached, you can go into everyone's inbox in the organization and basically rip that out and quarantine it?
Exactly.
That's awesome.
And so the maximum amount of time that takes is about 5 minutes.
Wow.
And I'll get into kind of how the PowerShell works in a bit, because we took, when I first started doing this, I was looking at how Microsoft wants you to go and delete mail from end users' inboxes. And if you follow their methods, it takes around 6 hours or so for a company of our size, because they have to reach out into every individual person's mailbox, check and see if that mail exists. If it does, then they quarantine it, pull it back to our inbox, delete it, stuff like that. But if it doesn't, then it just goes on to the next one, and this takes forever. So, and I'll get into kind of how we streamlined that. So we took that kind of 6-hour process down into a couple seconds.
That's awesome.
Cool.
So this is kind of the high level. Oh yeah, and we're tying into proxy cannon and proxy chains to do some active defense type stuff. Which if we have some time, I can talk about a little bit.
Okay.
I think that's cool.
Pretty fun. Yeah. So this is kind of the high level architecture of how we're doing this. So basically, you can see Pi in the center there. That's kind of the meat of the whole system. This is where we have our base PowerShell running that's doing all of the analytics and tying into Office 365, dynamically scraping the message trace logs, and sending all that data to the SIM. And as this analytics is happening, it will dynamically generate a case within LogRhythm, fire alarms, kind of do all the standard analytics that we normally do when looking into attacks. And so over on the right there, or on the right, you can see kind of we're doing regex checks at the top, looking at all the subjects, senders, content, kind of in that order. And then we're also tying into a bunch of open source and commercial solutions. So depending on what comes in, if it's a email that just is trying to get someone to send W-2s or something like that, we flag on the content within that message, which basically we use a risk score rating system, so that as we have positive indicators on each of these systems, it raises the threat score. Now, if it crosses a certain threshold where we know, okay, this is definitely malicious, we're actually going to go out and automatically pull that mail from everyone's system. And the cool thing is when we pull the mail, we still receive all the copies of it. So say we do it wrong or something, we get some legitimate mail, we can put this mail back and give this back to the recipients. But we kind of take the approach of rather being safe than sorry with this. We'd rather make sure we're quarantining anything malicious or anything that's an attack or attempting to steal credentials or trick someone than it is to let it go unchecked. And so we use a lot of these different methods and techniques to essentially do that.
And so you're also, Greg, correlating between PhishTank, Domain Tools, OpenDNS, Cisco AMP Threat Grid. What is Cuckoo?
So that's our sandbox. So that's essentially where if we get files or anything like that, so a macro document or something like that, we will throw that into our sandbox and then take the analytics results from that and then we'll push those back in, and then we read the results with Pi, and if it crosses a certain threshold, then we add that we add it to the case either way, and we keep a hard case which has all the actual evidence, and then there's also a SIM case. Where we can track it, and that helps us with metrics and understanding, okay, 100 people at the company received this mail, we pulled it from this many inboxes, and those types of things.
I may have missed it, but what's an AIE alarm? Or is that supposed to be a Pi alarm?
Yeah, so that's part of the SIM. So that's just the alarming engine within the SIM. So we just basically have rules tied into the SIM using threat lists and things like that. All the kind of standard techniques you would use for detecting those types of activities. So we can fire those alarms within the SIM, either when someone reports it, when we have a suspicious subject sent, when a message has been quarantined, those types of things, because it helps us keep a record of what's happened as well.
And I'm assuming that the alert level and the threat scoring level are configurable, so I can say at this threat score, remove those emails, and that's an adjustable setting for the user?
Exactly. And you can set that on both the Pi server directly. So say you aren't using LogRhythm, you're using something else, you can do everything we're doing here with whatever you want. So you could throw this in your own open source solution or whatever. But if you're using LogRhythm, we have the added benefit of doing some of that analytics on top of it within the SIM as well.
Gotcha.
And all of the responses to mails, we can do that from the SIM directly.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We will be distributing this video and the slides as well. So if you're having difficulty reading that, depending on your resolution and if you're on a mobile device or not, we will make these materials available to you after the broadcast.
All right. So I'll go on to the next slide.
Oh, so Greg, we have a question. So can Pi be used as a standalone or with QRadar/Splunk or only with LogRhythm? I think you answered that already, right? You can use it with whatever solution you have.
Right. So it's optimized towards LogRhythm, but the way we developed it was we have it modular. So you have a section where you configure API keys and other tie-ins that you want to integrate with. Mm-hmm. So I mean, you could use this with whatever you want. Of course, it is optimized for LogRhythm.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So essentially, right here we have an actual fish that we got. This one doesn't have any links or anything like that, but it's from our CEO, quote unquote. And it's funny when we started looking into all these attacks that we're getting and started gathering metrics and things like that, you start to see patterns of who's most targeted, what groups are most targeted, what types of attacks hit certain groups. And what we found is a lot of these attackers are going out and mapping out LinkedIn, finding everyone who's in finance, and then making these chained communications between all these people and then sending them to someone else in that group, especially targeting new people. So that's something where that user awareness and training comes in really handy, because we actually have them physically verify if they're going to send a wire transfer or anything like that.
And I see the button there in the upper right-hand corner, report phishing message.
Yeah, so that's essentially the button. So it's that little shield icon. And so essentially when they click this, it will soft delete the message on their system. So it'll move it into their trash, basically. And then this will forward it off to us as an attachment. So we basically will just want to give people a really easy way to do this without having to buy a commercial solution.
That's awesome.
Oh yeah, and I highlighted a couple stuff.
The button, yep.
Yep.
I missed it. Sorry. Okay.
No worries. And so when people do report this, we have just a very generic message that goes back to them. One of the most beneficial things we've seen with phishing response in general, the more feedback we can give to people, the better. So right now we have it pretty generic, just high level, thanks for reporting this. But one of the things we're also working on now is we want to have a leaderboard on the Pi server. So as these messages are reported, we're going to have a whole website that's basically, here's the top phishers, here's the top subjects we're seeing, here's who's reported the most. In addition to that, we want to have training and how to download the button and all those types of things there to try and give back to our users who are reporting these attacks and try and encourage more people to stay on top of it and report anything suspicious that comes in.
Awesome.
Next slide. All right, so this is where we get into how we were originally trying to investigate these phishing attacks and actually respond to them. So I know it's kind of hard to see in the PowerShell here, but once you get the slides, you'll be able to see kind of the commands that you would normally run to respond to a phishing attack and see who all at the company has received this message and how do we actually do a delete on their system. So normally, if we were to run it just like this, it's a very long process. You have to let this run for hours every time we've tried to do it. So next slide, please. So this is where we kind of refactored our approach to this. So instead of opening each inbox and looking for the message, what we did was set up a predefined phishing inbox. Now this is where people report it, but this is also where we do our analytics and correlation and saving all of the historical data of the attacks we're getting. So the way we do this is we scrape the message trace logs, and then we find all valid recipients, either by sender, subject, whatever you want to query on. And then we perform these targeted actions on each affected inbox. So we're only hitting the ones that we know actually received this message. And then we can either delete, we can block the senders, we can perform kind of whatever actions you want just using PowerShell. And then all of this, as we're doing this, we're dynamically gathering metrics for all of the attacks we're receiving and creating a case within LogRhythm. So it kind of helps us build our own internal threat list of here's known attacks we've seen, common subjects, common themes, those types of things. So it kind of helped us get ahead of this attack vector. And, next slide. So this is a screenshot of this tool called O365 Ninja. And so this basically ties into Office 365, and you can perform a bunch of different actions here. So up at the top here, you can see, so we can target a specific sender or a specific user within the company. And as you'll see in all of these, some of them have the nuke flag set. So setting the nuke flag, when you run this query, you're actually going to do a hard delete on that email. So anything matching that query, you're actually going to purge that from the recipient's inbox. So the top two lines are targeting specific email. The next group down is where we're going to capture all the emails. So this is the one we normally run, where we want to find if everyone at the company has received this mail or who's received it, basically, and how we go about going into everyone's inbox and pulling that mail out and essentially making it so most people might not even see these phishing attacks as they come in, as long as someone's reported it or it's matched on some of our checks. And now down below that, we have block the sender. So we can either do this per user or we can block them for the whole company. Just depends on how verbose or granular you want to get with this. And then we also added remove block sender because accidents happen.
Probably a good idea. And this isn't released yet, right? Like at the beginning of this, the get page was not there, but this is something you guys are planning on leaving, right?
Yeah, exactly. Especially this tool, because this piece especially, we want to give some people an easy way to respond to these attacks, however they find out about them, so they can actually run this and go find who all at the company has received it and also respond to it by completely removing these emails from their inbox. Now, we also have some other stuff down there where you can change a user's password. This is something where, say, you find out their account's compromised and they're sending spam out and stuff like that. You can actually go and force a password change on them, which will send you an email. You can contact them and let them know that they need to update their password. So kind of a last resort type thing, but we figured we should add it. And the very bottom one, we're starting to add some more features for checking the rules and configurations of Office 365. And so the last one, if you run with the check forwards flag, it's going to give you an output in out grid view in PowerShell of everyone who has forwarding rules set up on their inbox. So you can see if anyone's sending mail to a Gmail address or something like that. So that's essentially what we're trying to do with this part of the tool.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Very cool.
And so the kind of meat of the pie is the next part I want to talk about. So this is kind of how we're aggregating all the data. So it's funny, we're actually using a segregated Windows system with Outlook installed because it's just been great for reviewing these messages and getting a running list of all the attacks we're seeing. And so over on the left, actually, if you want to click, I have like a little pop-up thing that'll come up. So over on the left there, you can see how we kind of have this folder structure laid out. So in our inbox, whenever we get a new phish reported or we have something that's been quarantined, it'll come into the inbox. Now, once Pi runs on a scheduled interval, it's going to go through and start parsing that mail, and it'll put the reported mail in the completed box, and it'll put the actual attack in the spam box. And then down at the bottom, the processing folder is where we do all of our work. So that's where when you go out and say run the O365 Ninja tool, it's actually going to dump the mail into this folder so that you can comb through it and say, okay, here's the attacks we've received. Here's all of the email that maybe we want to run back through this system. So pretty straightforward. And next slide. So on the Pi server, we have essentially the layout of the logs here. This is kind of once you set this up, this is what it'll look like within your Pi directory. So the logs folder is where we're going to put all the message trace logs, admin activity logs, and things like that. And we have log rotation set up, so you can get a good historical view of this data, but you also aren't going to fill up the disk or anything like that.
Cool.
At the top there. Oh, yeah?
Oh, I just said cool. Sorry.
Oh. No worries. And at the top there is our cases folder. So this is where we're gonna dump the raw evidence for all of these attacks we're getting. So every single phish that's reported, we're gonna have a full case folder of a bunch of information related to that attack. We'll have the raw email, any attachments, a full report that has parsed out headers, analytics that have been done. We try and make a full report that's separate from the SIM because depending on what people want to do, they might not want to use case within the SIM. They might want to still capture this data. So we like giving people the option to collect this data and analyze it however they like. Now the scripts folder is where we put all of our extra kind of plugins, if you will. So everything we're tying into, like say OpenDNS, PhishTank, Cisco AMP Threat Grid, all those types of scripts we have just kind of set in here. And then within the Pi, so the invoke O365 trace is kind of the main meat of the whole system. And so that'll check within the scripts folder for whatever you set up, depending on how you want to respond to these attacks.
Cool.
And if you want to click, I think there's one more. Oh, there we go. So this is just a screenshot of the logs folder, kind of how that's laid out. All right. Next slide. Oh, I forgot to do animations on a couple of these.
Oh, no, there it goes.
That's okay.
Yep.
Animations. There we go. Now they're showing up.
Too many
Look at that.
animations.
They're flying in from different places.
There we go. It's crazy. So essentially, these are a bunch of the different tools we're tying into. There's actually more here that we can't really talk about just because we don't have authorization to. But essentially what we're trying to do is just track all of this, do as much analytics as we can. And so Palo Alto is one thing I haven't talked about yet, but we can tie into them directly and start banning IPs, do a search to see if anyone's touched any of these IPs that are related to a phishing attack. So right away we know if people have fallen for them as well. So that allows us to respond to the attack as well, in addition to just trying to proactively stop it.
Cool.
Now, Greg, a question is from our audience is, does this only work with Office 365, or is there a way to configure this with an on-premise Exchange installation?
Yeah, so right now we've only tested this with Office 365, but using the API tie-ins, they're very similar to Exchange, so that's something where we definitely could do that. We definitely want to do that next, and then look into Google Apps as well. But right now we've just been focused on Office 365, just because that's kind of what we're using here. So we're trying to make sure we're secure, being
Nice.
a security company. So this is the dashboard. So essentially, LogRhythm dashboard. This is what we put together to kind of keep an eye on all of the email traffic that's going inbound and outbound from our company. So over on the left here, you can see it's organized by top external sender and then top internal recipient. So that's key because we don't want to monitor everything from internal to internal and stuff like that. We're really looking to gather as much as we can about what's coming in from the outside, looking primarily for phishing attacks. Then over here in the center, we have our top origin host. So we're gathering IP addresses from where these messages originated. Down below that, the big red circle, this thing lights up red whenever a phishing email is reported. So kind of neat, you don't have to go to your alarms page to know that someone's reported one of these attacks. And on the right here, we just have the top external mail subjects. The cool thing about phishing, we're actually doing all of these on 1 hour increments. And the reason we do that is any phishing attack that's targeting like 10 or more people is instantly going to bubble up to the top. And right away you can tell from the subject that this is a suspect message, so we can respond pretty quickly and easily. Down at the bottom center there is where we have our phishing attack cases. So these are all the case management activity that we have tracked for all of the phishing attacks we've received for certain days. So it allows us to coordinate and get a high-level picture on the attack surface pretty quickly and easily.
Cool.
Yeah, we have just sender location and recipient location.
Nice.
Yeah. We go to the other guy just highlighted some stuff. And so now this page is our analyst breakdown. So this is where, say, we want to drill down into one of these attacks. It gives us a high-level view of just, say, whatever the specific query is. If you click, I think I highlighted what the query is on this page. Oh, yep. So up there, we're just looking for anything sent from a Russian email address. And so down there, subjects,
Hang on, sorry, Greg. John, I think there's some background noise in your...
Yeah, I'm going to mute out.
Okay. Sorry, so you had the current query there, Greg, which was what? In the upper left-hand corner.
Yeah, so that allows us to get a high-level picture very quickly and easily. You can do wildcard searches across all of the mail that's coming in and out of your company. And so this one, we're just looking for Russian email. Now from here, I don't know if I added another event on this page, but if you want, you could right-click on any of these events and perform actions. Say you want to go quarantine an email from one of these senders, you could just right-click on them and perform that action.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, so we tried to bake this into the SIM and make it really easy for our customers to do this as well.
Nice.
Next slide. So here's kind of the alarming and threat intelligence that we're tying into this. It's funny, like the subject matching that we're doing is actually very easy. I found this list from Swift on Security on Twitter, and it's like 20 items or so, but it's actually been great at finding all sorts of crazy attacks that are coming in because they all tend to match these standard regex patterns. So you can see those over on the right. In the middle, we have a bunch of the different threat list organizations that we tie into. Some of the real key ones are these email address ones because they'll usually get hints about some of the new and upcoming phishing campaigns before they hit our company. So we pull these in all day, every day, and then correlate with the alarms that we have going on the back end on the SIM. So over on the very left here, you can see these are just some of the alarms that we have set up looking for this activity. So just anything that we can alarm on makes it pretty easy.
Cool.
Yeah. And you can get creative. So the PowerShell we were talking about earlier, O365 Ninja, you can tie this in as a smart response within LogRhythm. So as you see events, as alarms fire or other events on your network happen, you can actually have any of these events trigger. Now, usually we recommend having these have some user intervention. So like you don't want to automatically go out and just quarantine mail that matches a regex or something like that, because it could be, you could have some issues there. And we also added checks to the script as well to make sure that you're not going to quarantine anything from your own company too. We just wanted to make sure people aren't accidentally deleting mail that say someone sent an email as a forward or something like that and Pi interpreted it wrong.
Gotcha.
So this is essentially where you configure that. And one of the things we've been doing a lot lately is chaining of events. So as you can see up on the top here, we have a number of events. We've actually been messing with hue lights in the SOC lately. So we toggle the room lights. We have the whole room turn red and stuff like that. We have a.
That's really funny.
It's just fun stuff.
Are you guys using like, what is it? It's
If this, then
hue?
that? Or
Yeah.
The hue lights for that?
We have it segregated. So that was one of the main things. Like, if we were going to do this, we didn't want it on our actual network. For obvious reasons.
You hacked the power grid in our office.
Yeah. No,
Hey guys, I got to jump off for another call. Thank you
Alrighty, John.
so much.
Thank you.
This looks really cool. So when can we be expecting to get a link for this, just out of curiosity before I bail?
So I would aim for 2 weeks out from today.
Very good. That's awesome. All right, I'm off. I'll talk to you guys later.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and Greg, we're just running a little short on time. I'm not sure how many slides.
No worries. We can cruise through this. Actually, this is just a image of the web UI where you can actually execute these dynamic actions from. So on the bottom right there, you can see what actions do you want to perform, and we can just select from any of these based on whatever we're clicked on over in the SIM view there.
I gotcha.
So basically, you don't have to run the PowerShell at all if you don't want to. You can just tie this into the SIM directly.
Cool.
No? Oh yeah, and I just zoomed in on that. But one of the main parts here is the automated case management and tracking. So we can see how many of these attacks we've received and generate actual succinct data on all the attacks we're seeing at our company. And so over here is just kind of an example of what this looks like. Over on the left, we're just messing with Spearfisher. And so we sent this little email here to everyone on our labs team. And so as soon as we sent this in and it triggered on the subject that we put in here, this case was generated. And this is what the case integration looks like. But basically, you see all the recipients down here, if there was anything to check. So this one didn't have links, so it didn't have anything to check. But kind of all that dynamic analysis just right there within a few seconds after an email is reported or it trips one of our sensors.
Sweet.
And here's just kind of a more breakdown of some of the actions that we can take on this. So over on the right here, we're assessing the link with threat grid. And you can see kind of here's the link to the share for the case where we store all the data, and it shows what the actual link was. We do a check on the link to see like what was out there. So this one returned a 404. Mm-hmm. So usually that'll kind of report back and won't increase our risk score.
Gotcha.
Okay. Whereas on the left here, you can see this one has a threat score of 22 based on various hacked WordPress links, as you can see kind of at the bottom there. And so that's just kind of the high level of what we're trying to do there. And this is just showing you can use both. You don't have to really tie into the SIM if you don't want to. For me, I'm more comfortable just messing with this stuff in PowerShell, whereas some of the folks on our SOC like using just the SIM directly. So we like giving people that option. And I think this is one of the last slides here. I know we're getting low on time, but this is an example of the case folder that's generated with every single phishing case that's reported, and some of the intelligence we're doing on the email itself. So on the right there, you can see all the data that we're collecting for all of these phishing attacks. And then the left is just this report that kind of aggregates, who reported this, who's the spammer, what's their name, what's the subject, who all received it. One of the things we've seen is spammers alternating subjects. So that's why we'll look for anything else from this specific sender, and we'll aggregate all that data here. Nice. So it kind of just gives us a really, really nice 30,000-foot view of this attack just by looking at the report here.
Oh, hey, look, there's the link.
Yeah, coming soon. Hopefully.
Coming soon. So on your GitHub, you'll post a link to this. Well, Greg, thank you very much for your time today. And as I said before to all of our listeners and viewers, that we will publish the links to the presentation and to the video. For those of you who might have missed it as well, you're not here to hear me say this, but you will get a link to both the slides and the video once the broadcast has ended, probably either later today or tomorrow morning. So thank you again, Greg. Thank you, John, who had to bail for another call. But thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.